My name is Madison, 33 years old, and until my sister's wedding night, I thought the worst thing my family ever did to me was simply ignore my existence. I was profoundly wrong. The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club were sparkling, the expensive champagne was flowing freely, and my younger sister Ashley's $150,000 wedding reception was in full swing when the ultimate betrayal was finally spoken out loud. We were seated at the grand head table, draped in imported white silk and covered in hundreds of cascading white roses. My mother Brenda was completely in her element, holding court and accepting endless compliments from wealthy guests about what a perfect supportive mother she had always been. She wore a custom silver gown, smiling graciously as people praised her dedication to her children. I sat at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, entirely accustomed to being the invisible middle child in this absurd theatrical production. Then my sister-in-law, Kendra, had finally had enough. Kendra is a brilliant, no-nonsense African-American woman who married my spineless brother Jason 5 years ago, and she has never quite stomached my family's toxic dynamics. She had been sitting there sipping her third dirty martini, quietly watching my mother play the flawless, loving matriarch. The hypocrisy was evidently making her sick. Suddenly, Kendra slammed her martini glass down on the thick glass tabletop so hard, I actually thought the delicate crystal stem would shatter into pieces. The sharp, aggressive clack echoed loudly over the soft jazz band playing in the background. "Are you going to play the perfect mother all night, Brenda?" Kendra's voice was not a screaming tantrum, but it was incredibly loud and sharp enough to cut right through the cheerful chatter of the surrounding tables. Jason immediately grabbed Kendra's arm, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "Keep your voice down," he hissed through his teeth, terrified of any public scandal. But Kendra aggressively yanked her arm away, her dark eyes flashing with absolute fury. "No, Jason. I am completely done watching this fake performance." She stood up slightly, leaning over the wide table, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my mother's face. "Madison, you know she hid your Stanford acceptance letter 12 years ago, right?" We all knew. She intercepted it in the mail, opened it, and threw it in the shredder so you would be forced to stay home and watch Ashley get all the college funds. The jazz music seemed to fade into a dull hum. Complete suffocating silence fell over the entire head table. A few guests sitting nearby literally stopped talking, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. For 12 long years, I truly believed I simply had not been good enough for my absolute dream school. I believed that rejection was a direct reflection of my own mediocrity. I looked sharply at my brother Jason. He cowardly refused to meet my eyes, staring intensely at his expensive prime rib. I looked at Ashley, the golden child who was busy fixing her diamond tiara in her phone reflection, looking utterly unbothered by the fact that her entire life was funded by my stolen future. Finally, I looked directly across the table at the woman who gave birth to me. I waited for the panicked denial. I waited for her to act outraged, to call Kendra a malicious liar, to put on the dramatic tears she was so famous for using to get her way. Brenda did not flinch. She did not panic at all. Instead, she picked up her crystal wine glass, took a very slow, deliberate sip of her rich Cabernet, and calmly set it down. A cold, arrogant smirk slowly spread across her heavily contoured face. She looked me right in the eye without an ounce of guilt. "So what if I did?" she said, her voice dripping with unapologetic venom. "It was a mercy, Madison. You were a quiet, socially awkward girl who spent all her time reading in her room. You would not have lasted a single semester at a competitive place like Stanford. You would have crumbled under the pressure and embarrassed this family. That tuition money was much better spent on Ashley's private design school. She actually had the talent and the charm to make something of herself." Her harsh words hung in the air, heavy and incredibly cruel. She actually believed she was completely untouchable. She honestly thought I was still that timid 21-year-old girl who would just lower her head, absorb the emotional abuse, and quietly excuse herself to cry in the bathroom. She thought she had won. She thought this lavish, ridiculously expensive wedding was her ultimate victory lap, proving once and for all that she was the absolute master of our family's narrative and my destiny. If your family ever sabotaged your future, stole your hard-earned opportunities, or underestimated your worth, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you are going to want to see exactly what I pulled out of my purse next. I did not cry and I did not scream. I just smiled back at her. Slowly, with deliberate grace, I reached down beside my chair and picked up my black leather Hermes bag. I unclasped the signature gold hardware, the faint metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the deafening silence of the dining room. Every single eye at the head table was locked onto my hands. My mother, still holding that arrogant smirk, watched me with a mix of mild amusement and deep condescension. She probably expected me to pull out a tissue to wipe away tears, or perhaps grab my car keys to run away and hide. Instead, I reached inside the velvet lining and pulled out a stiff plastic card attached to a crimson lanyard. I did not slide it across the table. I tossed it. The card landed with a sharp clatter, right next to her crystal wine glass face up. Brenda blinked, looking down at it. The bold, unmistakable red and white logo of Stanford University gleamed under the chandeliers. Right below the crest, printed in crisp black letters, was my full name. And right beneath my name was my official title: Guest Lecturer, Department of Economics and Business. "You are entirely right, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and pleasant. I definitely could not last as a student. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and lacing my fingers together. So I went back as a professor instead. I teach advanced venture capital strategies to the graduating seniors. They actually pay me quite a lot of money to do it. The smug, victorious smile on my mother's face completely vanished. It did not just fade, it shattered. Her jaw went slack, and the deep wrinkles around her mouth, usually hidden by expensive fillers, suddenly became very pronounced. She stared at the ID card as if it were a venomous snake coiled next to her dinner plate. Ashley stopped fixing her tiara, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. But I was not even close to being finished. Before Brenda could formulate a single word, before her brain could even process the reality of my career, I reached back into my bag. This time I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with stark red legal tape. I tossed it just as carelessly as the ID, but this envelope was heavy. It landed with a loud, wet thud directly on top of her expensive prime rib dinner, splashing a drop of dark gravy onto her custom silver gown. "Hey, what is wrong with you?" Jason finally barked, trying to find his courage. "You are ruining her dress." I ignored him completely. My eyes locked solely on Brenda. "Open it, Mom," I commanded. My tone left absolutely no room for debate. It was the voice I used in boardrooms to crush corporate takeovers. Her hands were actually trembling as she reached for the envelope. She tore the red tape, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. The bold heading on the very first page was impossible to miss: Notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. Brenda let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The paper slipped from her fingers, scattering across the white silk tablecloth. "You see, Mom," I continued, leaning back in my chair and admiring the absolute panic flooding her eyes. "When you secretly took out a second mortgage on the family house to fund Ashley's lavish lifestyle, her European vacations, and this ridiculous wedding, you assumed you could just keep floating the minimum payments. You assumed the bank would give you endless extensions because you are a prominent member of this country club. But banks do not care about your social status. They sell toxic, underwater debt to private equity firms to clear their books." I paused, letting the reality sink into her bones. "My investment firm bought that portfolio of debt last month. I own your mortgage. And since you are currently 4 months behind on your payments, I legally executed the foreclosure clause." Brenda was turning a concerning shade of gray. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former venom. "I am your mother. You cannot take my home. It is not your home anymore." "Brenda," I replied, my voice as cold as ice. "The property officially transferred to my holding company at noon today. Those documents are your final notice. You have until exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to vacate the premises. If you are still inside the house at 1 minute past 8, the county sheriff will physically remove you for trespassing on private property." Kendra let out a low, impressed whistle, taking another sip of her martini. She looked absolutely delighted. The air in the room felt electric. My mother, the woman who had spent her entire life meticulously crafting an image of wealth superiority and perfect control, was hyperventilating over a ruined plate of prime rib. I had legally, financially, and systematically dismantled her entire life. She looked wildly around the table, desperately seeking anyone to jump to her defense. But there was nothing. No applause for her perfect parenting, no sympathetic whispers. Only the cold, hard reality that tomorrow morning the neighbors she spent decades impressing would watch her get locked out of her own driveway. The silence following my announcement did not last long. It was shattered by a piercing, high-pitched shriek that forced several guests near us to physically cover their ears. Ashley suddenly stood up violently, shoving her chair backward. It tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor, completely ruining the carefully curated elegance of the head table. She was not crying out of sympathy for our mother's sudden impending homelessness. She was shaking with absolute rage because the spotlight had abruptly shifted away from her. "Are you completely insane?" Madison Ashley screamed, her face twisting into an ugly, furious sneer that completely ruined her bridal makeup. "You are ruining my aesthetic. I paid $10,000 for the videographer to capture candid moments of family joy during dinner, and you are sitting here throwing fake eviction notices at our mother. You are so violently jealous of me that you had to invent this pathetic fantasy just to steal my moment." I just stared at her. "Ashley," I said calmly, "the county sheriff executing the warrant tomorrow morning is not a fantasy. You might want to help her pack instead of yelling." "Security!" Ashley screeched, waving her arms wildly toward the venue staff hovering near the kitchen doors. "Somebody get this bitter, jealous spinster out of my wedding right now. She is destroying my perfect day." Before the confused venue staff could even take a step forward, Tyler decided it was his moment to play the heroic alpha male. He stood up, adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo with an arrogant flick of his wrists. Tyler was the quintessential modern tech bro, all inflated ego buzzwords and unearned confidence. He walked around the table and stepped directly into my personal space, towering over me and trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic small-time scammer," Tyler sneered, pointing his finger inches from my face. "I do not know what cheap, fraudulent paperwork you printed off the internet to try and scare your mother, but it ends right now. You are a joke. You teach a couple of college classes and suddenly you think you are a billionaire. It is actually embarrassing to watch you try to flex on us." I did not back away an inch. I simply tilted my head, looking at his manicured finger. "You are dangerously close to my face, Tyler," I warned him, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "I suggest you step back before you do something that ruins more than just your wedding reception." Tyler let out a loud, mocking laugh, making sure the surrounding tables could hear his bravado. "Oh, I am so terrified of the bitter older sister," he mocked loudly. "Let me tell you how the real world works, Madison. The world where real money exists. You think a stupid mortgage matters to us. You think you can intimidate this family when they have me backing them up." He turned away from me, dramatically opening his arms to address Brenda, who was still hyperventilating over her ruined prime rib. "Do not shed a single tear over that dump," Brenda, Tyler announced grandly, his voice echoing across the ballroom. "Let her have the stupid house. It was getting old and outdated anyway." Tyler puffed out his chest, radiating absolute arrogance. "My AI software startup is finalizing our Series seed funding this week. We are closing a $5 million round with Blackwood Ventures, the most exclusive, aggressive venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Once the ink dries on Friday, 5 million goes straight into my corporate accounts. I am going to buy you a brand new 10,000 square foot mansion in an even better zip code than the one you are in now. We will pay cash right up front just to spite her. Brenda looked up at him, her tear-streaked face suddenly filling with desperate hope. Her golden child had married a savior. "Oh, Tyler, you are such a blessing to this family," she sobbed, reaching out to grab his hand. Tyler looked back down at me, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. "So take your fake papers and get out of my wedding," he commanded. "You are a minor annoyance to people who actually have wealth and power." I looked at Tyler. I looked at his expensive velvet tuxedo, his perfectly styled hair, and the absolute certainty in his eyes. He had just staked his entire ego, his marriage, and his mother-in-law's future on a $5 million term sheet from Blackwood Ventures. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to burst out laughing right in his arrogant face. I reached into my bag and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen, the bright light reflecting in Tyler's smug, condescending eyes. "Are you calling an Uber?" he sneered, crossing his arms over his expensive velvet tuxedo. "Because I think it is definitely time for you to leave before I have the staff physically throw you out." I completely ignored his childish taunt. My fingers moved swiftly across the screen, bypassing my personal apps and opening a highly encrypted dual authentication application. It was my executive portal. I looked up at him, my expression completely blank and devoid of any emotion. "Blackwood Ventures is an incredibly ruthless firm, Tyler," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough weight to make him pause. "They are famous in Silicon Valley for their aggressive due diligence and their strictly anonymous founder. Very few people actually know who sits at the top of that specific financial food chain." Tyler rolled his eyes, sighing heavily as if he were explaining basic math to a toddler. "Everybody in the industry knows how Blackwood operates, Madison. That is exactly why getting their backing is such a massive deal. They only fund the top 1% of tech startups. My company passed every single one of their brutal stress tests. We are absolutely bulletproof. You trying to name-drop my investors just shows how desperate you are to seem relevant in a world you do not understand." I tapped my final biometric password into the secure server and accessed the active term sheets dashboard. I scrolled down the list of pending investments until I found his company name. "Oh, I know you passed the initial stress tests," I replied smoothly. "Your predictive software is actually quite decent. But the investment committee was severely divided on your personal leadership skills. They noted in their risk assessment that you were arrogant, incredibly impulsive, and prone to making terrible decisions under pressure. The only reason your company even received that $5 million term sheet last week was because the CEO personally stepped in and authorized the risk against the board's advice." Tyler frowned deeply, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He uncrossed his arms. "How do you know anything about my internal committee reviews?" he demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "Those files are strictly confidential under a strict non-disclosure agreement." I locked my eyes directly onto his. "Because I am the one who authorized the risk, Tyler. I am the anonymous founder and CEO of Blackwood Ventures." Before his brain could even process the absolute impossibility of my statement, my thumb hovered over the glowing red button on my screen. It was the executive override command to instantly withdraw any pending term sheet before the final signatures were executed. "And since you just proved my committee entirely right about your terrible judgment and lack of emotional control, I am correcting my mistake." I pressed the button. Less than a second later, a sharp, piercing ping echoed from the inside pocket of Tyler's velvet tuxedo jacket. The automated notification sound was so distinct and out of place in the tense silence of the dining room that everyone at the head table physically flinched. Tyler stood completely frozen in place. The aggressive posture he had taken just moments ago evaporated. The color began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. "Check your phone, Tyler," I suggested, gently leaning back in my chair. His hand was visibly shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone and stared down at the lock screen. The bright notification illuminated his horrified features. It was an automated high-priority email sent directly from the Blackwood Ventures legal department. The subject line was brutal, absolute, and legally binding. Immediate withdrawal of Series Seed term sheet and cessation of funding. No, he whispered, his voice cracking, as he frantically swiped the screen to open the full email attachment. He scanned the legal jargon, his eyes darting wildly across the text. This is a mistake. This is a system glitch. You cannot do this. We have massive payroll due on Friday. We have international server costs. If Blackwood pulls out now, the other angel investors will immediately panic and trigger their exit clauses. My company will be completely insolvent by Monday morning. I put my phone back into my Hermes bag and snapped the gold clasp shut. There is no glitch, Tyler. You just insulted the one person holding your entire professional life together. You stood there and bragged about buying my mother a 10,000 square foot mansion with my own firm's money. You are not buying her a mansion. You are not even going to be able to afford the rent on your own luxury apartment next month. Your startup is officially dead, and you killed it just to impress a woman who is about to be evicted from her home tomorrow morning. Tyler stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single syllable. The reality of his absolute financial ruin had entirely paralyzed him. But before the heavy silence could fully settle over the ruined wedding reception, my older brother Jason finally found his misplaced courage. Jason slammed both of his hands down flat on the glass table, making the silverware rattle violently. He shot up from his chair, his face contorted with a mix of fear and furious indignation. "You are a complete monster, Madison," he screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed across the ballroom. Guests from the surrounding tables were now openly staring, some even holding up their phones to record the spectacular collapse of our family. "How could you do this to your own blood?" Jason demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You sat on this information for months, just so you could come to your sister's wedding and destroy everyone. You are ruining Mom's life, you are ruining Ashley's special day, and you just bankrupted Tyler for absolutely no reason. You are a psychopath. You are tearing this entire family apart over an old piece of mail." I did not even blink at his outburst. Jason was 35 years old, stuck in a dead-end middle management job, and had spent his entire life desperately clinging to my mother's apron strings. He never possessed an original thought or an ounce of backbone. I opened my mouth to respond, but I did not have to. Kendra moved faster than I could. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching harshly against the polished hardwood floor. She reached over, grabbed Jason by the lapels of his expensive suit, and violently shoved him backward. Jason stumbled, losing his balance completely, and crashed heavily back into his seat. "Sit down and shut your pathetic mouth, Jason," Kendra hissed, her voice radiating absolute authority and disgust. "Do not say another word to her." Jason stared up at his wife in total shock. His hands raised defensively. "Kendra, what are you doing?" he stammered, looking around frantically at the whispering guests. "You are supposed to be on my side. We are family." Kendra let out a sharp, bitter laugh that cut through the tension. "I am not on the side of a family of toxic, abusive parasites," she declared loudly, making sure Brenda and Ashley heard every single word. "I have sat at these miserable family dinners for 5 years, Jason. I have watched all of you treat Madison like she is the dirt beneath your shoes. I have watched your mother use her as a punching bag to make herself feel superior." She turned her fierce gaze toward Ashley, who was still crying hysterically. "And for what?" Kendra asked mockingly. "So you could treat this spoiled, useless princess like absolute royalty. Ashley has never worked a hard day in her entire life. She gets her credit cards paid off by Mommy, she gets her rent covered, and she gets a $150,000 wedding handed to her on a silver platter. Meanwhile, Madison built an empire entirely by herself, from absolute scratch, after her own mother stole her college tuition." Kendra then leveled her intense stare directly at Brenda, who was still clutching the foreclosure notice. You did not just steal a piece of mail, Brenda. You tried to steal her entire future because you were terrified she would outshine your precious golden child. And she did it anyway. She became 10 times the woman Ashley will ever be. Madison did not destroy this family today. You destroyed it 12 years ago when you put that acceptance letter into a paper shredder. Madison is just handing you the final bill. Kendra, please. Jason pleaded weakly, his face pale and slick with sweat. You are making a huge scene. People are staring at us. Let them stare. Kendra snapped back, not breaking eye contact with my brother. Maybe if you cared as much about protecting your sister as you do about impressing these fake country club snobs, you would be half the man I thought I married. You are a coward, Jason. You have always been a coward. You sat here and watched your mother try to humiliate Madison, and you said absolutely nothing. But the second Madison fights back and defends herself, suddenly she is the monster. You make me sick. I looked at Kendra, feeling a profound sense of respect wash over me. For my entire life, I had fought these battles completely alone. I was the permanent scapegoat, the designated target for their collective insecurities. But standing right here in the middle of this ridiculous display of unearned wealth and deep hypocrisy, Kendra was tearing down their facade brick by miserable brick. My mother realized her grip on the situation was entirely gone. With Jason completely neutralized by his wife and Tyler paralyzed by his ruined startup, Brenda was backed into a corner. I watched the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes. The arrogant smirk was dead. In its place, she summoned the manipulative gaslighting persona she had perfected over decades. She took a deep, shaky breath and physically leaned across the wide table, trying to grab my hands. I pulled them back smoothly, resting them in my lap out of her desperate reach. Madison, please listen to reason. Brenda began, her voice suddenly trembling with manufactured emotion. The fake tears were already welling up in her eyes, a performance she had used to manipulate my father for years. You have made your point. You are successful. You proved us all wrong, but this is going entirely too far. You cannot just destroy Tyler's company. He is going to be your brother-in-law. Family helps family. You have millions of dollars at your disposal. Reinstating that term sheet is nothing to you, but it means everything to Ashley's future. I raised an eyebrow, completely immune to her pathetic theatrics. Family helps family, I repeated slowly, letting the absolute hypocrisy of those words echo between us. Is that the exact same family philosophy you applied when you shredded my Stanford acceptance letter and drained my entire college fund behind my back? Brenda waved her hand dismissively, as if destroying my academic future and stealing my money was a minor scheduling error. That was 12 years ago, Madison. You seriously need to let go of this toxic resentment. I did not steal your college fund. I simply reallocated family resources where they were needed most. You were always the tough one. You were smart and resilient. You could figure things out on your own. But Ashley was delicate. She had a rare creative gift that desperately needed to be nurtured. She gestured grandly toward Ashley, who was currently aggressively dabbing at her ruined mascara with a silk napkin, playing the victim perfectly. Ashley needed that money to attend the prestigious Vanguard Institute of Design. You know exactly how expensive elite private art schools are. She needed the absolute best environment to cultivate her talent. And look at the return on that investment. Brenda's voice grew louder, desperately trying to rally the remaining guests who were still watching our table with morbid fascination. She is a top-tier fashion designer now. She runs her own incredibly lucrative boutique brand. Her aesthetic vision is highly sought after by wealthy clients all over the city. She deserved the world, Madison, and as her mother, I made the hard choice to give it to her. You're just bitter because you had to take the harder path. But look at you now. It built your character. You should honestly be thanking me for pushing you to succeed on your own. I stared at the woman sitting across from me. Her delusion was not just a defense mechanism. It was a complete, alternate reality she had constructed to justify her own staggering cruelty. She honestly believed that robbing one child to fund the delusions of another was a masterclass in parenting. She actually expected gratitude for her betrayal. You reallocated my resources so Ashley could become a top-tier designer, I asked, keeping my voice deceptively calm and inquisitive. That is your final official justification for stealing $100,000 of my tuition money? Brenda nodded firmly, her chin lifted in a pathetic display of maternal pride. Yes, and I would do it again without hesitation. Ashley is a visionary. Her brand is thriving. She is about to be featured in major lifestyle magazines. You having a fancy corporate title does not change the fact that she is a brilliant artist who brings beauty into the world. You are just a cold calculator who only understands numbers and spreadsheets. You could never understand her artistic genius. Tyler, who had been staring blankly at his phone this entire time, finally looked up. He looked completely broken, but Brenda's words seemed to trigger a desperate spark of hope in his eyes. He looked at Ashley, perhaps trying to convince himself that even if his tech company was ruined, his new wife's booming fashion empire could keep them financially afloat. He needed a safety net, and Brenda was selling him the illusion of one. I let the heavy silence hang for a few seconds. I looked at Brenda's defiant face, then at Ashley's tear-stained cheeks, and finally at Tyler's desperate, pleading eyes. They were clinging to this ridiculous illusion of Ashley's massive success as a shield against the absolute financial ruin I had just dropped on their heads. They actually thought her fake design empire was going to save them from the consequences of their actions. I slowly opened my Hermes bag for the third time tonight. I had warned them. I had given them every opportunity to just sit there in their quiet humiliation. But Brenda had to push it. She had to double down on the golden child's fictional brilliance, and I was more than happy to shatter that illusion next. My hand slipped past my leather wallet and closed around a thick spiral-bound document. I pulled it out and let it drop onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. It was 50 pages long, bound in a dark blue cover, and stamped with the unmistakable bold red seal of a premier private investigation firm. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the document and slid it directly across the smooth glass, sending it stopping right in front of Tyler. He stared down at the blue cover, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked entirely defeated from the Blackwood Ventures rejection, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread forced him to reach out and touch the edge of the folder. "That is a comprehensive background and financial health check," I stated cleanly, my voice projecting perfectly over the soft jazz music. "My venture capital firm runs these on every single founder before we invest a single dollar. Since you were so eager to brag about your new wife's top-tier design empire, saving your finances, I thought you should see the due diligence I pulled on her last week." Ashley let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her hands slammed onto the table, knocking over her crystal water glass. "Tyler, do not open that," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure terror. She lunged across her empty dinner plate, desperately trying to snatch the folder away from him. "That is private property. You have no right to look into my personal business." Tyler reacted purely on instinct. He pulled the folder quickly out of her reach, his eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "If your business is so incredibly lucrative, Ashley, why are you screaming like a cornered animal?" he snapped back at her. His desperation to find a financial lifeline was rapidly turning into panic. He flipped open the heavy cover, staring at the executive summary printed on the very first page. "I will save you the trouble of reading the dense legal jargon," Tyler, I offered, generously leaning forward and resting my chin on my folded hands. "Let us go through the highlights together." Page 3 details her academic career. Brenda just proudly announced that my stolen college fund was used to nurture her delicate creative genius at the Vanguard Institute of Design. But if you look at the registrar records, you will see that Ashley dropped out of Vanguard 6 weeks into her second semester. She failed 3 foundational classes and was placed on academic probation before she voluntarily withdrew. Brenda shook her head violently, her heavy earrings swaying. No, that is a complete lie, she stammered, looking frantically between me and her golden child. Ashley graduated with honors. I have the framed diploma hanging in my living room right now. You have a very expensive piece of printed parchment that she ordered online for $80, Mom, I corrected her without missing a single beat. The private investigator confirmed it is entirely counterfeit. Tyler flipped the page rapidly, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. Where did the money go then? He demanded, his eyes scanning the financial columns. $100,000 does not just vanish into thin air. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Turn to page 12. Tyler, you will find a very detailed breakdown of her international wire transfers and credit card statements from that exact year. Ashley did not use my tuition money to study art. She used it to rent private villas in Ibiza. She bought VIP bottle service at exclusive nightclubs, chartered yachts with her unemployed friends, and purchased designer handbags to maintain her wealthy aesthetic on social media. She blew through $100,000 of stolen money in less than 9 months. Ashley was sobbing hysterically now, hiding her face in her hands, no longer even attempting to deny the allegations. But that is not even the worst part, Tyler. I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving tone. Because while blowing stolen money is tragic, blowing your new husband's financial future is unforgivable. Turn to page 42. Tyler flipped the thick pages with trembling hands. He stopped, his eyes going incredibly wide as he stared at the highlighted red numbers on the paper. You see, Tyler, while Ashley was playing the role of a highly successful fashion designer, her actual revenue was practically zero. To keep up the facade, she had to borrow very heavily. She currently has exactly $80,000 in hidden high-interest credit card debt. And because her own credit score was completely destroyed years ago, she secretly opened 3 of those platinum cards using your social security number and your home address. Tyler dropped the heavy folder onto the table as if the pages themselves had suddenly caught fire. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He slowly turned his head to look at the woman in the custom white gown sitting next to him. You stole my identity, Tyler whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying mixture of shock and suppressed rage. You used my social security number to take out $80,000 in debt behind my back. Ashley shrank away from him, her hands trembling as she wiped at her ruined makeup. I was going to pay it back, she sobbed loudly, her voice taking on that pathetic whining tone she always used when she was caught in a lie. I just needed a little bit of runway to scale my brand. The new collection was about to launch. I was going to pay off the balances before you ever found out. Tyler grabbed his hair, his perfect grooming completely ruined as he dragged his fingers across his scalp. How do you have zero revenue? He shouted, no longer caring about the wedding guests staring at them. You have thousands of followers on social media. You have a boutique space downtown. Where is the money coming from? I reached over and tapped the blue folder lying between us. Keep reading, Tyler. Turn to page 45. That is where my investigators broke down her entire supply chain and business model. Tyler frantically flipped the pages, nearly tearing them in his haste. His eyes darted rapidly across the paragraphs, his lips moving silently as he processed the information. Let me save you the agonizing read, I offered, leaning back and crossing my arms. My mother just called Ashley a visionary artist. The truth is that your new wife has never designed a single piece of clothing in her entire life. Her highly lucrative design business is nothing but a massive coordinated scam. Brenda slammed her hand on the table. That is slander, Madison, she hissed defensively. It is heavily documented fact. Mom, I shot back instantly. What Ashley actually does is scour the internet for independent struggling artists on platforms like Etsy. She steals their original digital prints, downloads the high-resolution files, and sends them to a cheap manufacturer overseas to be printed onto low-quality silk and polyester. Then she sews her own luxury tags onto the garments and sells them to wealthy women in this exact country club for 1,000% markup. She is not a designer. She is a parasite. Tyler looked sick. He stared at Ashley, who was now refusing to meet his eyes. "You are stealing from small creators," he asked, his voice hollow. "She is not just stealing," I corrected him sharply. "She is getting caught. If you look at the appendix of that report, you will find copies of over a dozen cease and desist letters sent to her business address over the past 6 months." Ashley ignored every single one of them. She thought because these were independent artists with limited resources, they could not touch her. She thought she could just block them on social media and keep stealing their work to fund her lifestyle. Ashley let out a miserable wail, burying her face in her hands. But she severely underestimated them. I continued, my voice cold and relentless. "Those artists found each other. They pooled their resources and hired a very aggressive intellectual property firm based in New York. A massive class action lawsuit for copyright infringement, fraud, and punitive damages is being filed against her company this coming Tuesday. They are going to freeze her business accounts, seize her inventory, and seek personal damages that will completely bankrupt her." Tyler dropped the folder. It slid slightly across the glass, coming to a rest near his empty champagne flute. He looked at Ashley not with love or even anger, but with absolute disgust. "You lied to me about everything," Tyler said, his voice terrifyingly calm now. "You lied about your education. You lied about your money. You committed felony identity theft against me to fund a fake business built entirely on stolen artwork." "I love you," Ashley cried out, reaching across the table to grab his arm. "We can fix this, Tyler. My mom can help us. We are a family now." Tyler violently yanked his arm out of her grasp. He looked down at her hands as if she were covered in a toxic substance. The realization was hitting him with the force of a freight train. He was not marrying a visionary designer who was going to elevate his social status. He was marrying a broke, uneducated criminal who was about to be sued into absolute oblivion. And because they had just signed a marriage license an hour ago, her massive legal liabilities were about to become his absolute nightmare. Tyler physically backed away from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He looked at Ashley as if she were a total stranger, shaking his head slowly. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in real time. He had tied his entire life, his social standing, and his financial future to a woman who had used him as a credit line for a criminal enterprise. He reached up and loosened his bow tie, suddenly struggling to breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of the lavish reception. Brenda saw the golden child's perfect fairy tale collapsing. Her beautiful, expensive vision was dissolving into a nightmare of debt and lawsuits before the wedding cake had even been cut. Panic, raw and unadulterated, finally seized her. But Brenda was a master manipulator. Instead of surrendering to the absolute truth of her daughter's fraud, she decided to go on the offensive. She stood up so violently that her knees knocked the heavy glass table, causing the crystal centerpieces to wobble precariously. "That is enough," Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with a hysterical edge that silenced the entire room. The few guests who had dared to start whispering immediately snapped their mouths shut. She pointed a trembling, heavily ringed finger directly at my chest. "You listen to me right now, Madison. You think you have won because you dug up some temporary financial issues? You think you can waltz in here with your fancy corporate titles and your stolen money and destroy my family? But you are forgetting one very important detail." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "And what detail is that, Mom?" Brenda let out a harsh, breathless laugh. She turned to Tyler, her eyes wide and manic, desperately trying to reel him back in. "Tyler, listen to me. You do not need to worry about the credit cards. You do not even need to worry about your startup losing that venture capital funding. Ashley does not need her design business anyway. It was just a hobby." Tyler stared at her, his face a mask of exhausted confusion. "How can you possibly say that?" he demanded, his voice hollow. "She has $80,000 in debt in my name. The wedding is not even paid for. We have nothing." "We have your father's estate," Brenda declared triumphantly, whirling back around to face me. Her chest heaved with exertion, a twisted smile of absolute superiority returning to her face. My father had passed away 5 years ago after a sudden heart attack. He had built a highly successful commercial real estate development firm, amassing a significant fortune over his lifetime. "You really thought you held all the cards today, Madison?" She sneered, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the country club. "But you are nothing. When your father died, he left his entire estate to me and Ashley. Every single bank account, every single commercial property, the stocks, the bonds, the offshore accounts. All of it." She stepped around the table, moving closer to me, her eyes burning with a venomous hatred I had known my entire life. "Your father knew exactly what you were, Madison. He knew you were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of family loyalty. That is why he legally disinherited you. He sat in his lawyer's office and specifically wrote you out of his will, calling you a rebellious disappointment who did not deserve a single dime of his hard-earned legacy." Ashley, sensing a lifeline, immediately stopped crying. She sat up straighter, wiping her ruined mascara. "That is right," she sniffled, looking at Tyler with desperate, pleading eyes. "Daddy left us millions. We are liquidating the primary commercial assets next month. The lawyers are just finalizing the probate paperwork. I can pay off the credit cards instantly. I can fund your entire tech startup myself." "We do not need her money, Tyler. We are rich." Brenda nodded vigorously, her silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers as she stood tall and victorious. "So you can take your foreclosure notice and your background checks and get out of this country club, Madison. We have millions of dollars coming to us. You are just a bitter, disinherited spinster who will never have the love or the legacy of this family." I did not flinch. I did not argue with her. I did not try to defend my relationship with my late father. I simply lifted my left wrist and looked down at the face of my diamond watch. The second hand ticked precisely past the 12. "Right on time," I whispered softly. A fraction of a second later, the massive heavy oak doors at the far end of the banquet hall swung open with a loud, authoritative thud. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark charcoal pinstripe suit stepped over the threshold. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his expression was entirely devoid of warmth. In his right hand, he carried a heavy brushed aluminum briefcase secured with two visible combination locks. He did not pause to look at the lavish floral arrangements or the terrified guests. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor with a steady military precision as he marched directly toward the head table. The joyful, celebratory atmosphere of the country club evaporated instantly, replaced by the chilling clinical air of a corporate boardroom. Brenda squinted at the approaching figure, her victorious smile faltering. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Security! Why are random people walking into my daughter's private reception? Get him out of here immediately!" Ashley, entirely losing whatever composure she had left, started screaming at the venue manager who was hovering near the kitchen. "I paid for a private event. You cannot just let strangers wander in here and ruin my aesthetic." Tyler did not say a word. He just stared at the briefcase, his face pale, sensing with the sharp instinct of a drowning man that the heavy aluminum box contained the final nail in his coffin. The man stopped exactly 2 feet from our table. He did not acknowledge Brenda or Ashley. He looked directly at me and gave a curt, respectful nod. "Good evening, Madison," he said, his deep baritone voice effortlessly commanding the room. "Are we ready to proceed?" I nodded smoothly. "Yes, we are." I turned my attention back to my mother, who was now clutching the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "Mom, I would like to formally introduce you to Mr. Thomas Gallagher. He is the senior managing partner at Gallagher and Associates, the most aggressive estate litigation firm on the East Coast. And more importantly, he is my personal corporate attorney." Brenda let out a short, dismissive scoff, though her eyes betrayed her absolute panic. "I do not care if he is the President of the United States," she snapped, trying to project a confidence she no longer possessed. "You cannot bring your lawyer to a wedding. Your father left everything to me. It is a closed case. The probate court sealed the documents 5 years ago. You have absolutely no legal standing here. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the glass table. That is where you are completely wrong, Mom, I said softly. Dad did not trust you. He spent the last 10 years of his life watching you manipulate everyone around you. He watched you spoil Ashley into a useless liability, and he watched you try to systematically destroy my confidence. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless, manipulative woman he married. You really thought a man who built a commercial real estate empire from nothing was stupid enough to leave his entire legacy unprotected in your greedy hands. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward, placing the heavy aluminum briefcase directly onto the glass table right next to Brenda's ruined dinner plate. He entered the combination codes. The heavy metal latches popped open with a sharp, synchronized crack that made my brother Jason physically jump in his seat. Mr. Gallagher opened the lid and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in dark leather. He turned to face my mother, his expression merciless. Mrs. Brenda, Mr. Gallagher began, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom so that every single guest could hear him clearly. 5 years ago, you presented a standard boilerplate will to the probate court. That document successfully transferred the primary liquid assets and the family home into your name. You assumed that was the entirety of your late husband's estate. You assumed you had successfully disinherited your eldest daughter. You were, however, operating under a very carefully constructed illusion. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but Mr. Gallagher raised a single commanding hand, silencing her instantly. I am not here to negotiate with you today, he stated coldly. I am here to execute the final legally binding directives of a secret trust established by your late husband 3 years prior to his death. This trust was specifically designed to permanently bypass the probate court and remain entirely hidden from you until Madison reached her 33rd birthday. He held up a thick, sealed legal envelope. Tonight, I am officially lifting the veil on the reality of your financial situation, and I am formally serving you with the indisputable documented evidence of your own financial crimes. Your reign of manipulation and theft ends tonight in this room. Brenda stared at the heavy legal envelope in Mr. Gallagher's hand, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking haggard under the bright chandelier lights. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sheer gravity of his presence kept her silent. Mr. Gallagher did not hand her the envelope just yet. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek iPad. He tapped the screen, connecting it seamlessly to the country club's high-end audio system hooked up to the speakers surrounding the banquet hall. "What are you doing?" Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "Turn that off immediately." Mr. Gallagher ignored her entirely. He looked directly at me. 12 years ago, Madison, your father, came home early from a business trip. He walked into his home office and noticed the paper shredder was jammed. Being a meticulous man, he opened the machine to clear the blockage. Inside, he found the shredded remains of a heavy parchment envelope with the Stanford University crest printed on the return address. He spent 4 hours sitting on his floor, painstakingly taping those shredded strips of paper back together. When he finished, he realized exactly what your mother had done. A collective gasp rippled through the wedding guests lingering at their tables, captivated by the unfolding drama. Ashley looked at her mother, her eyes wide with shock. "You told him she got rejected," Ashley muttered. "You said she failed the entrance exams." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, unable to meet her golden child's gaze. Mr. Gallagher continued, his voice steady. "Your father was devastated. He confronted your mother that very night. But instead of apologizing, she threatened to file for a highly publicized divorce and drag his business through a brutal settlement process if he told you the truth. She held his empire hostage to protect her fabricated narrative. Your father chose to play the long game. He pretended to let it go and favor Ashley. But quietly behind closed doors, he began making entirely different arrangements. He knew his health was failing, and he could not leave your future in the hands of a woman capable of such cruelty. So 3 years before his fatal heart attack, he sat in my office and recorded a video confession to accompany his true legal directives. Mr. Gallagher pressed a button on the screen. A sharp burst of static hissed through the overhead speakers, followed by someone clearing their throat. Then a voice echoed through the silent banquet hall. It was a voice I had not heard in 5 long years. Deep, raspy, and tired. It was my father. "Hello, Madison. If you are hearing this, it means you have finally turned 33, and Mr. Gallagher has executed my final wishes." The sound of his voice sent a violent chill down my spine. Across the table, Jason put his head in his hands. Brenda covered her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror, as her deceased husband's voice exposed her deepest secrets. "I am so incredibly sorry, Madison." The recording continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am so sorry I was not a much stronger man when you desperately needed me. I am sorry I let your mother tear down your confidence. And I am terribly sorry I did not stop her from destroying your Stanford acceptance letter. I found the pieces in the trash, sweetheart. I taped them back together. I kept that letter in my safe deposit box every day since then. It broke my heart to watch you believe you were not good enough." When he finally spoke again, the sorrow was gone, replaced by a cold anger. "Brenda, if you are listening to this, you need to know your cruelty did not win. You spent our marriage manipulating our children, turning them against each other, and prioritizing Ashley's vanity over Madison's brilliance. You thought you could control my legacy. You thought you could steal Madison's future and use my money to fund your superficial life. But you are a thief, Brenda. You stole from our daughter, and as I recently discovered, you have been actively embezzling from my commercial accounts for years. I will not allow you to destroy the empire I built. I will not allow you to leave Madison with nothing. You disinherited yourself the moment you put that letter into the shredder." The audio clicked off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The impact of my father's words hung heavily in the air, wrapping around Brenda like a suffocating blanket. She stood completely frozen at the dining table, staring blankly ahead in absolute and total shock. Her carefully constructed reality and her guaranteed inheritance had just been publicly obliterated by the husband she thought she had successfully outsmarted. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the waitstaff stood entirely frozen by the kitchen's swinging doors. Brenda looked as if the solid floor had vanished completely beneath her expensive designer heels. Mr. Gallagher calmly reached back into his brushed aluminum briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents, these printed on heavy watermarked parchment. He adjusted his silver glasses and looked directly at the horrified mother of the bride. "The document you submitted to the probate court 5 years ago was entirely superseded by this legally updated will, Mr. Gallagher announced, his deep voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy air. "Your late husband did not leave the entirety of his commercial empire to you. Recognizing your deep financial instability and malicious intent, he removed you completely as the primary beneficiary of his massive corporate life insurance policy. We are talking about a total payout of $12 million. He secretly funneled every single penny of that policy into an irrevocable blind trust entirely shielded from probate court naming Madison as the sole and exclusive beneficiary." I watched Ashley's jaw physically drop. $12 million, she whispered out loud, her voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of the lost wealth finally hit her. Tyler closed his eyes, leaning his head back against his velvet chair, as if he might pass out. The $5 million investment he had just lost from my venture capital firm suddenly made perfect sense to him. I leaned forward, resting my hands evenly on the glass table. "That is exactly right," I said smoothly. "Where do you think the seed capital for Blackwood Ventures came from? Dad gave me the massive financial foundation, and I multiplied it 10 times over. I did not build my investment empire from nothing. I built it with the ultimate apology from a man who finally realized how deeply he had failed me all those years ago." Brenda's breathing was incredibly ragged and shallow. She grabbed the edge of the table, desperately trying to anchor herself in a reality that was rapidly disintegrating around her. "But I still have the company," she argued, her voice a desperate pleading rasp. The commercial real estate firm is still in my legal name. The properties are still generating monthly revenue. You cannot take the physical business away from me. I am the legal majority shareholder. Mr. Gallagher did not smile, but a cold glint of absolute legal finality flashed briefly in his eyes. He reached into his briefcase one last time and extracted a bright red folder. He did not hand it to her. He held it up for everyone at the head table to see clearly. You are currently the majority shareholder, Mrs. Brenda. That is factually correct. However, you are also the primary target of a massive federal investigation. Before your husband passed away, he hired a ruthless forensic accounting firm to secretly audit the company's books. He strongly suspected you were skimming money to fund your extravagant social lifestyle and Ashley's fraudulent design business. His suspicions were entirely correct. Brenda flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck across the face. Mr. Gallagher opened the red folder and began listing her offenses with surgical precision. Over a period of 6 years, you systematically transferred company funds into private offshore accounts. You falsified corporate expense reports, manipulated vendor invoices, and committed egregious tax evasion. You did not just mismanage the company finances. You committed wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Those are severe federal crimes carrying mandatory prison sentences. Your husband documented everything, and per his strict instructions, my law firm handed this entire forensic dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. The words federal crimes and prison sentences echoed over the elegant white centerpieces. The wealthy country club guests, the people Brenda had spent decades desperately trying to impress, were now whispering frantically to each other. Some were already quietly edging toward the exits, terrified of being associated with a woman about to be indicted by the federal government. Brenda looked wildly around the room, her eyes wide with a feral, trapped panic. She looked at her golden child, but Ashley was physically backing away from her, terrified of being implicated in the financial fraud. She looked at Jason, who was staring blankly at his empty dinner plate, entirely useless as always. The empire she thought she had stolen was entirely built on sand. Her money was gone. Her home was foreclosed. Her reputation was permanently destroyed, and now her freedom was about to be taken away by federal agents. Checkmate, Mom, I whispered softly into the deafening silence. You played a very long game of deception, but you underestimated the people you hurt. Your reign is officially and permanently over. Brenda's knees buckled. It was not a dramatic, calculated feint designed to elicit sympathy from the crowd. It was a genuine structural collapse of her entire body. She fell heavily backward into her velvet dining chair, her arms dropping lifelessly to her sides. The heavy crystal wine glass she had been aggressively guarding tipped over, sending a pool of dark red Cabernet spilling across the pristine white silk tablecloth. It looked exactly like spreading blood soaking into the delicate fabric right next to her foreclosed mortgage documents and the federal forensic accounting dossier. She stared blankly at the spreading red stain, her jaw slack, her chest barely moving. The vibrant, arrogant matriarch who had commanded this luxurious room just 20 minutes ago had vanished entirely. In her place sat a hollow, terrified woman staring directly into the abyss of her own making. No, she finally gasped, shaking her head slowly from side to side as if trying to wake up from a terrible nightmare. No, this cannot possibly be real. There are laws. There are strict spousal protections in this state. You cannot just leave a widow with absolutely nothing. She looked up at Mr. Gallagher with wild, desperate eyes. I will contest it, she threatened, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper that lacked any real conviction. I will hire my own legal team. I will drag this secret trust into probate court and tie it up in endless litigation for the next 20 years. You cannot legally strip a wife of her marital assets without a massive fight. Mr. Gallagher did not even blink at her empty threat. He adjusted his suit jacket, his face a mask of supreme professional indifference. You are certainly welcome to try, Mrs. Brenda, he replied smoothly. However, to hire a legal team, you would need capital. And as I previously mentioned, your corporate accounts are frozen. Your personal credit cards are suspended, and your primary residence is foreclosed. You do not have the financial liquidity to hire a junior paralegal, let alone a team of aggressive corporate litigators. Furthermore, your late husband anticipated this exact reaction. He included a very specific ironclad contestability clause in the trust. Any attempt to challenge the legality of the document immediately triggers the automatic release of additional financial evidence directly to the Internal Revenue Service, effectively multiplying your felony tax evasion charges. He paused, leaning forward slightly, letting the absolute finality of his words settle over her like concrete. You have zero loopholes, he stated firmly. You have no legal standing, no financial resources, and no defensible position in any court of law. You are legally, completely, and utterly bankrupt. Brenda turned her head slowly, looking at the familiar faces around her. She was searching desperately for a savior. She looked at Ashley, her beautiful, spoiled, golden child. Ashley was pressing herself as far back into her chair as physically possible, staring at our mother with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Ashley did not care about Brenda's impending prison sentence or her profound humiliation. She only cared that the endless stream of family money had suddenly dried up and left her exposed. "Mom, how could you do this to me?" Ashley whimpered selfishly, completely ignoring the fact that Brenda had committed federal crimes, specifically to fund Ashley's own fraudulent lifestyle. "You ruined my expensive wedding. You ruined my entire life." Brenda recoiled from her daughter's harsh rejection. She reached a trembling, desperate hand out toward Jason. "Jason, please," she begged, real tears finally spilling down her heavily contoured cheeks. "You have to help me. You are my son. You have to let me stay with you while I figure this out." Jason looked at the woman who had controlled his entire existence. Then, he looked across the table at his wife Kendra, who was watching him with a fierce, uncompromising stare that dared him to make the wrong choice. Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. "I cannot do it, Mom," Jason mumbled, looking down at his lap like a reprimanded child. "I do not have the money, and I absolutely cannot be involved in a federal investigation. I am sorry." I watched the scene unfold with a sense of profound clinical detachment. I had spent my entire childhood terrified of this woman. I had spent my adolescence craving her validation. And I had spent my 20s trying to heal from the immense damage she had inflicted on my self-worth. But looking at her now stripped of her stolen money, her fake prestige and her toxic enablers, I felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no sadness, just the quiet, satisfying equilibrium of cosmic justice finally balancing its scales. She was completely isolated. Absolute zero. "You always told me that the real world was harsh, Mom," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her pathetic sobbing. "You told me that weak people get eaten alive and that only the strong survive. You used that exact philosophy to justify destroying my college acceptance letter. You thought you were teaching me a brutal lesson about power." Brenda looked up at me, her face smeared with expensive makeup and bitter tears. Well, I listened. I continued maintaining absolute eye contact. I learned the lesson perfectly. I just applied it much better than you ever did. Tyler had been standing perfectly still during my entire exchange with Brenda and Mr. Gallagher. His eyes had darted frantically between the federal forensic dossier and the heavy blue background check folder still resting on the table. The illusion of his wealthy aesthetic future was completely shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal indictments, massive credit card debt, and impending intellectual property lawsuits. He looked at my mother, who was now weeping pathetically into her hands, and then he looked at Ashley. Ashley reached out a trembling hand toward him. "Tyler, we can still make this work," she pleaded, her voice a high-pitched, desperate whine. "We have each other. We can start over. We do not need her money or my mother's real estate. I will get a job. I will pay it all back. Just please do not leave me here." Tyler did not reach back to comfort her. Instead, he slammed his open palm down on top of the blue background check folder with a force that made the crystal water glasses violently rattle against the glass table. The sharp, explosive sound made Ashley physically flinch backward, pulling her hand away as if she had been burned. "Make this work," Tyler repeated, his voice dangerously low, trembling with a potent mix of fear and absolute disgust. "Are you completely out of your mind? There is no making this work, Ashley. You are a criminal. Your mother is a criminal. You used my social security number to secretly rack up $80,000 in high-interest debt, and you lied to me about every single aspect of your pathetic, fraudulent existence. But I did it for us." Ashley cried, tears carving thick black lines of mascara down her cheeks, completely ruining her expensive bridal makeup. "I did it so we could have the perfect life. I wanted to be a partner you could be proud of." "You did it for yourself," Tyler snapped back, his voice rising in volume until it echoed across the silent banquet hall. Every single guest was watching him now, completely captivated by the spectacular implosion of the golden child's perfect day. The wealthy country club members, who had just been toasting to their happiness, were now whispering frantically, their phones out, recording every miserable second of this confrontation. You wanted the aesthetic of being a wealthy designer without doing any of the actual work. You thought you could just steal from small artists and use me as your personal credit line when things went wrong. Tyler grabbed the lapels of his custom velvet tuxedo. He violently yanked the expensive white rose boutonniere from his buttonhole, tearing the delicate silk fabric of his jacket in the process. He threw the crushed flower directly at Ashley. It bounced off the intricate lace bodice of her custom white gown and landed directly in the spilled red wine on the tablecloth, soaking up the dark liquid. "I am completely done," Tyler announced, his voice booming with absolute finality. He turned his back on her and addressed the entire room of stunned, wealthy guests. "The wedding is officially canceled. If any of you brought expensive gifts, I highly suggest you take them home right now, because this entire family is about to have their assets seized by the federal government." "Tyler, no!" Ashley shrieked. She jumped out of her chair, her heavy white gown tangling around her legs, and threw her arms tightly around his waist. "You cannot leave me. We signed the marriage license an hour ago. We are legally married. You are my husband. You promised to protect me." Tyler looked down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He grabbed her wrists and forcefully peeled her hands off his velvet tuxedo, shoving her away from him. "We signed a piece of paper in front of a fake officiant for a photo opportunity," he sneered, looking directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. "But that license has not been filed with the county clerk yet, and it never will be. My lawyer is going to rip that document to shreds first thing tomorrow morning, right after I file a police report against you for identity theft and credit card fraud. I will not tie my name, my professional reputation, or my ruined startup to a bankrupt, thieving fraudster." He took a large step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the toxic wreckage of my family. He looked at Brenda, who was too consumed by her own impending federal prison sentence to even try and intervene. He looked at Jason, who was actively shrinking away from the chaos. Finally, Tyler looked directly at me. There was no arrogant smirk left on his face. There was no bragging about 10,000 square foot mansions or his brilliant tech company. He just looked completely defeated, realizing that his own hubris and greed had blinded him to the massive scam he had married into. "Keep the term sheet," Madison Tyler said bitterly, adjusting his torn collar one last time. "I do not want any part of this family or your money ever again." Without waiting for a single response, Tyler turned sharply on his heel. He marched down the center aisle of the banquet hall, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly against the polished floor as the sea of guests actively parted to let him through. Ashley collapsed onto her knees, right in the middle of the dining room, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically as the heavy oak doors swung shut behind the man who was supposed to be her ultimate savior. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, echoing like a final gavel through the silent banquet hall. Ashley remained on the polished hardwood floor for a few agonizing seconds, her shoulders violently shaking as she sobbed into her hands. The entire room watched the golden child completely fall apart. But then, the high-pitched wailing abruptly stopped. She slowly lowered her hands. Her face was an absolute disaster of smeared cosmetics and raw emotion, but the despair in her eyes was rapidly hardening into something else entirely. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Ashley scrambled to her feet, her expensive high heels slipping slightly on the slick floor. She grabbed fistfuls of her heavy custom white gown, tearing the delicate lace as she stomped back toward the head table. I remained perfectly still, assuming she was coming for me. But Ashley completely ignored me. She bypassed my chair entirely and lunged directly across the glass table toward Brenda. Ashley's hands slammed down right on top of the foreclosure notice, and the federal dossier, her manicured nails practically digging into the paper. "You ruined my life!" Ashley screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shredding vocal cords as she spat the words directly into our mother's terrified face. "This is entirely your fault. You did this to me." Brenda recoiled, pressing herself hard against the back of her velvet chair. "Ashley, please calm down," she pleaded weakly, holding her hands up in a desperate attempt to pacify the monster she had painstakingly created. "People are staring." "Well, we can figure this out. I do not care who is staring," Ashley shrieked completely, losing whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. "Figure it out? How are you going to figure this out, Mom? You are going to federal prison. Tyler just left me. I have $80,000 in debt and zero income. You promised me I would always be taken care of. You promised me I would never have to struggle like normal people." Brenda's fake tears returned. "I gave you everything I possibly could," she cried, her voice cracking. "I gave you money and education. I sacrificed my own financial security so you could have a beautiful life. How can you attack me?" "You did not support a business," Ashley roared back, leaning even closer, her face inches from Brenda's. "You funded a delusion. You knew what I was doing on Etsy. You knew I was not designing anything, but you told me it was fine. You told me everyone fakes it until they make it. You never once told me no. You never made me get a real job. You made me entirely dependent on you, and then you went and bankrupted yourself." The wealthy guests in the room were absolutely mesmerized by the grotesque display. The picture-perfect mother and daughter duo, who had spent years acting superior to everyone else in this country club, were now aggressively tearing each other to pieces over the remains of a ruined wedding dinner. "And what about the letter?" Ashley demanded, her voice echoing off the chandeliers. "You shredded Madison's Stanford letter. Why did you do that, Mom? You told me she failed. You made me believe I was the smart one. You made me think I was the talented one. You lied to me my entire life just to stroke your own massive ego. You used me to play out your sick fantasy because you were too insecure to handle Madison's success." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically stabbed. "I did it to protect you," she wailed defensively, finally showing her true colors. "I did it so you would not feel inferior. Madison was too smart. I wanted you to shine. I did it entirely for you." "You did it for yourself," Ashley spat back, completely rejecting the maternal manipulation. "You crippled me. You turned me into a useless, uneducated fraud who cannot even pay a credit card bill without stealing an identity. You made me completely pathetic. And now you have nothing left to give me. I wish I had never listened to you. I hate you." The words struck Brenda like a physical blow. The absolute worst fear of any narcissistic parent had just materialized right in front of her. Her golden child, the entire justification for her decades of cruelty and manipulation, had turned around and fiercely rejected her. Brenda covered her face with both hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of pure defeat. Ashley did not offer a single ounce of comfort. She stepped back from the table, breathing heavily, looking at the sobbing woman with absolute disgust. The beautiful facade was not just cracked, it was pulverized into dust, utterly destroyed by the very hands that built it. The heavy silence that followed Ashley's brutal rejection of our mother was broken only by the frantic whispering of the wedding guests. Dozens of camera phones were still pointed directly at the head table, capturing every humiliating second of my family's spectacular downfall. Jason had spent his entire life carefully avoiding any form of conflict. He was the ultimate coward, a man who survived the toxic environment of our childhood by simply blending into the background and agreeing with whoever was shouting the loudest. Now faced with the complete public destruction of his family's reputation, his only instinct was to run. He stood up from his chair, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He looked around the ballroom at the wealthy country club members, the people he desperately networked with to advance his own mediocre career. His eyes darted toward the exit. He needed to escape the blast radius before the federal agents arrived or before anyone associated him with his mother's financial crimes. Jason quickly stepped around the overturned chairs and reached for Kendra. She was standing tall and completely composed, watching the wreckage of the golden child with a look of profound satisfaction. Jason grabbed her arm tightly, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of her evening gown. "We are leaving right now, Kendra," Jason hissed, his voice trembling with panic. He tried to pull her toward the side exit, away from the glaring lights and the staring crowd. "Come on, I am not staying here for another minute. This is a complete disaster. If my boss finds out my mother is being indicted for federal wire fraud, I will lose my promotion. We have to get out of here before anyone asks us questions." He tugged on her arm again, expecting her to simply follow him blindly, like she always did when his family created a scene. But Kendra did not take a single step forward. Instead, she planted her high heels firmly onto the polished hardwood floor. With a swift, aggressive motion, Kendra violently yanked her arm out of his grasp. The sudden force of her movement caught Jason completely off guard, causing him to stumble backward. "Do not ever grab me like that again," Jason, Kendra said. Her voice dangerously quiet but carrying an immense weight of absolute authority. Jason looked at her in shock, rubbing his hands together nervously. "What are you doing?" he pleaded, looking around to see if anyone had noticed their altercation. "We have to go. Madison has completely lost her mind and ruined everything. My mother is going to jail." Tyler walked out. "I am not going down with this sinking ship." "You are the sinking ship," Jason, Kendra replied coldly. "You have spent your entire life watching your mother destroy Madison. You sat at this very table tonight and watched her try to humiliate your sister again, and you said absolutely nothing. You only care about this family falling apart because it might embarrass you in front of your golf buddies. You are a pathetic coward." Jason flushed a deep, angry red. "I am trying to protect us," he argued defensively. "I am trying to protect our marriage from this insane drama. Now please let us just go home." Kendra let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of any warmth or affection. "We do not have a home anymore, Jason. Not together." She reached down and picked up her elegant black clutch from the table. She unclasped it with a sharp snap and reached inside. Jason watched her, completely confused by her calm, deliberate actions in the middle of a total crisis. She was not panicking, she was executing a plan. Kendra pulled a thick, folded manila envelope from her clutch. She held it out and slapped it directly against Jason's chest. He instinctively brought his hands up to catch it before it fell to the floor. "What is this?" Jason asked, staring down at the unmarked envelope in his hands. "That is your exit strategy," Kendra stated, her eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. "But I am not going anywhere with you. Those are the divorce papers, Jason. I signed them yesterday morning in front of a notary. I am completely done being married to a man who cowers in the shadow of his toxic mother. I am done watching you throw your sister to the wolves just to save your own skin." Jason stared at the envelope, his mouth opening and closing as his brain tried to process this new catastrophic failure. "Divorce." He finally whispered the word, barely making it past his lips. "You cannot leave me right now. My entire family is falling apart. I need you." "No." Jason, Kendra corrected him smoothly, stepping back and aligning herself physically closer to me. You need a shield. And I am done taking the hits for you. You can walk out of those doors and run away from your mother just like you always run away from everything else in your life. But you are going to be running away completely alone. Jason stood completely frozen, the manila envelope pressed against his chest, as if it were a physical weight crushing his lungs. He stared at Kendra, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization that his wife had just served him divorce papers in the middle of his family's annihilation was short-circuiting his brain. He looked around the room expecting someone to stop this. He wanted the venue manager to intervene or for the guests to object. But there was no one left to save him from this nightmare. You cannot mean this. Jason finally stammered, his voice cracking as he held the envelope up. We just bought a house together. We were talking about having kids next year. You cannot just throw all of that away because my mother made some terrible financial decisions. I had absolutely nothing to do with her offshore accounts or her fraudulent business. I am completely innocent in all of this. You know I always try to stay out of the drama. Kendra let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Innocent, she repeated, her voice dripping with pure disdain. You think sitting back and watching your mother abuse your sister for decades makes you innocent? You think turning a blind eye while your mother embezzled corporate funds makes you a good person? You are not innocent, Jason. You are entirely complicit. Your silence was a weapon they used to keep Madison down. She took a step closer, her dark eyes flashing with fierce fire. You want to know exactly how Madison got her hands on all of that highly classified financial evidence? Kendra asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. You want to know how the federal agents received a perfectly organized forensic dossier detailing every illegal wire transfer your mother made over the last 6 years. Jason blinked, his brow furrowing, as a terrifying confusion washed over his face. What are you talking about? He whispered. I am talking about the last 6 months of my life, Kendra declared with absolute clarity. I am talking about the countless Sunday dinners at your mother's house. While you were sitting in the living room drinking scotch and trying to earn her approval, I was excusing myself to use the restroom. But I went straight into your mother's home office. Brenda let out a loud gasp, her tear-streaked face snapping up to stare at her daughter-in-law in absolute horror. That is right, Brenda, Kendra said, turning toward the shattered matriarch. I know exactly where you kept the key to your locked filing cabinet. I spent months photographing every bank statement, fake vendor invoice, and offshore account routing number you tried to hide. I compiled the raw data and handed it directly to Madison to build an airtight federal case. Jason looked like he was going to be physically sick. The color drained from his face entirely. He stumbled back a step, leaning against a chair. You spied on my mother, he breathed, staring at his wife as if she were a total stranger. You were working with Madison behind my back this entire time. I was not just spying on her finances. Kendra continued, turning her attention back to Ashley. I also intercepted the mail. When Ashley used our home address to register her fake design business, she accidentally sent all her legal correspondence straight to our mailbox. Every time an independent artist sent a cease and desist letter, Kendra explained, I pulled it out of the mailbox before you got home. I opened them, copied them, and sent them to Madison. Then I resealed them and put them back on the counter for Ashley to ignore. I gave Madison every single piece of ammunition she needed to coordinate that massive intellectual property lawsuit and destroy this fraudulent empire. You destroyed my family! Jason shouted, his fear giving way to a desperate anger. You were supposed to be loyal to me. I am completely loyal to the truth, Kendra fired back instantly. And I am loyal to the only person in this miserable family who ever actually treated me with a shred of genuine respect. Madison welcomed me. She treated me like a human being while your mother constantly made passive-aggressive comments, and your sister always treated me like unpaid help. I realized early on that this family was a toxic, rotting ship, and I decided to help Madison sink it. Kendra adjusted her elegant clutch, her posture perfect. So take the divorce papers, Jason. My lawyer will finalize the split. I have already moved all of my personal belongings out of our house this morning while you were getting dressed for this ridiculous wedding. You have nothing left to offer me, and I have absolutely no intention of sinking with you. Jason slowly sank back into his chair, the thick manila envelope clutched tightly against his chest, like a paper shield that could no longer protect him from the harsh reality of his ruined life. Kendra did not look back even once. She turned around, her posture absolutely flawless, and walked steadily out of the silent banquet hall through the exact same heavy oak doors Tyler had used just moments before. The double exit left a suffocating heavy vacuum in the massive dining room. In less than 30 minutes, the picture-perfect wealthy family dynamic Brenda had spent her entire adult life violently enforcing had been reduced to absolute ash. Jason was getting divorced and left completely alone. Ashley was dumped, publicly humiliated and drowning in fraudulent debt. Brenda looked at the shattered remains of her precious golden children. Ashley was still curled into a pathetic ball on the polished hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the ruined lace of her custom white wedding gown. Jason was staring blankly at the far wall, completely broken by the sudden loss of his brilliant wife and his carefully crafted dignity. Brenda had no husband left to manipulate or bail her out of trouble. She had no corporate accounts left to secretly drain. Her foreclosed home was waiting to lock her out early tomorrow morning, and federal agents were actively preparing her arrest warrant. The terrifying reality hit her with a sickening clarity. She turned her head slowly, her heavily mascaraed eyes locking onto the only person in the entire country club who still possessed the financial and legal power to stop this impending nightmare. Me. She did not stand up with her usual arrogant, commanding posture. Instead, Brenda slipped off her velvet dining chair, her knees hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. She practically crawled around the edge of the long glass table, her expensive, custom silver gown dragging through the dark puddle of spilled red wine without a single care. The wealthy country club guests gasped collectively, whispering frantically as they watched the once proud domineering matriarch completely abandon her pride. Brenda reached my chair and threw her arms out, grabbing the heavy silk fabric of my dress with desperate, trembling hands. She buried her face into the folds of my skirt, sobbing with a frantic, animalistic intensity that made my skin physically crawl. "Madison, please," Brenda wailed loudly, her voice muffled against the expensive fabric. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I did to you. I was wrong about the acceptance letter. I was wrong about the family business. I was wrong about everything. You have to call off your corporate lawyers. You have to stop the federal agents before they issue the arrest warrants. Please do not let them put me in a prison cell. I am an older woman. I will not survive in a place like that." She looked up at me, her face completely ruined by thick black tears and absolute panic. "I gave you life, Madison. You came from my own body. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. I am your mother. Please have mercy on me." I looked down at the pathetic broken woman kneeling at my feet. For so many years of my life, I had desperately craved this exact moment. I had wanted her to finally see me, to acknowledge my inherent worth, and to beg for my forgiveness. But staring at her now, listening to her hysterical pleas, I realized her tears had absolutely nothing to do with genuine remorse. She was not crying because she had callously destroyed my Stanford acceptance letter. She was not crying because she had stolen $100,000 of my tuition money. She was only crying because she had finally been caught, and the severe consequences of her own criminal actions were about to lock her inside a federal penitentiary. My heart felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical emptiness. I did not raise my voice or insult her. I simply reached down and placed my hands firmly over hers. Slowly, and with methodical, unforgiving precision, I began to pry her manicured fingers off the silk fabric of my dress, one by one. "You giving me life does not give you the right to systematically destroy mine," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. I pulled her last trembling finger away and dropped her hands back into her lap, stepping back to break all physical contact. "You made your choices, Mom. Now you get to live with the consequences. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her kneeling on the hardwood floor amidst the ruins of her fake empire. I walked back toward my chair, the heavy silk of my dress swishing softly in the quiet room. Before I could even sit down, the heavy double doors at the far end of the banquet hall swung open once again. This time it was not an angry groom or a ruthless corporate lawyer. It was Mr. Harrison, the general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club. He was a small, meticulously groomed man who had spent the entire evening hovering around the edges of the reception, making sure every single detail of the lavish $150,000 wedding was executed perfectly. Now he looked incredibly pale, sweating profusely under the bright chandelier lights. He walked quickly toward the head table, clutching a thick black leather folio tightly to his chest like a shield. Mr. Harrison stopped a few feet away from the wreckage of the head table. He looked at Ashley, who was still sobbing hysterically on the floor. He looked at Jason, who was staring blankly at his divorce papers. And finally, he looked down at Brenda, the wealthy matriarch, who was currently kneeling in a puddle of spilled wine. He cleared his throat nervously, the sound echoing loudly in the tense silence of the ballroom. "Excuse me, Mrs. Brenda," Mr. Harrison said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt, but we have a very urgent administrative issue that requires your immediate attention." Brenda slowly lifted her head. Her face was a horrific mask of smeared mascara and absolute despair. She looked at the venue manager with hollow, exhausted eyes, completely incapable of processing another disaster. "What is it, Harrison?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you not see that my family is going through a massive crisis right now?" "I understand, ma'am, and I deeply apologize, Mr. Harrison stammered, taking a small step backward. "But it concerns the final payment for tonight's event." Brenda waved a trembling hand dismissively. "Tyler is paying the balance," she mumbled, pointing vaguely toward the doors Tyler had stormed out of. "Go find Tyler. He is the groom. He is handling the catering and the open bar." Mr. Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his tight collar. "Yes, ma'am, we are aware of that arrangement." Tyler was scheduled to settle the remaining balance of $150,000 at the conclusion of dinner. However, when my accounting staff attempted to run the credit card he placed on file this afternoon, the transaction was immediately declined. Ashley's sobbing abruptly stopped. She looked up at the manager, her ruined face pale. "Declined," she echoed hollowly. "Yes, Miss Ashley," Mr. Harrison confirmed, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "We tried to process the card 3 separate times, but the bank issuer has placed a hard freeze on the account. We also attempted to contact Tyler on his cell phone, but it appears his number has been disconnected. It seems he canceled the card and turned off his phone the moment he left the property." Brenda stared at him, her brain struggling to comprehend the massive financial blow that had just been casually dropped into her lap. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the glass table for support. "What do you mean he canceled the card?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "You have to make him pay. He drank your champagne. He ate your prime rib. It is his wedding." "Actually, ma'am, it is your wedding," Mr. Harrison corrected her, his tone shifting slightly from apologetic to firm. "Tyler was simply listed as the secondary payer. Your signature is the only one on the master venue contract. You legally assumed full financial responsibility for the entirety of this event, including all catering, alcohol staff, overtime, and property damages." He opened the black leather folio and pulled out a crisp, itemized invoice. He placed it carefully on the glass table, right next to the spilled wine and the federal foreclosure documents. "The total outstanding balance for tonight's reception is $150,000, Mrs. Brenda. Per country club policy, all event balances must be settled in full before the guests leave the premises. I need you to provide an alternative method of payment right now." Brenda stared blankly at the massive number printed at the bottom of the page. She had spent the last year bragging to every single person in this room about how she was throwing the wedding of the decade for her beautiful golden child. She had specifically ordered the most expensive champagne, the rarest flowers, and the highest tier menu to impress these wealthy guests. She had assumed Tyler's tech startup money would cover the extravagant bill. Now Tyler was gone, and she was left holding the bag for a six-figure party she could not possibly afford. Brenda scrambled back to her feet, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the glass table to steady herself. She could not process the reality of being completely broke. For over 3 decades, her entire identity had been deeply rooted in her limitless purchasing power. Money was her armor, her weapon, and her only source of genuine authority. She reached blindly onto the table and grabbed her jewel-encrusted evening bag. Her fingers fumbled frantically with the clasp, nearly tearing the delicate silk lining as she ripped out her designer leather wallet. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving in erratic, panicked gasps. "This is completely ridiculous," Brenda snapped, trying desperately to summon the haughty, condescending tone she always used with service workers. She was putting on a show for the wealthy guests who were still actively watching her every move. "Tyler is just throwing a childish tantrum. It does not matter. I will gladly cover the final invoice myself. I have more than enough liquidity to pay for my own daughter's wedding." She pulled out a sleek, heavy metal American Express Platinum card and practically shoved it into Mr. Harrison's chest. "Here, run this one, and add a 20% gratuity for the inconvenience. I want this embarrassing conversation over with immediately so my guests can enjoy the rest of their evening." Mr. Harrison looked incredibly doubtful, but he had a job to do. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and retrieved a sleek wireless mobile payment terminal. He tapped the screen, entering the massive $150,000 charge, plus the gratuity Brenda had just arrogantly demanded. The screen glowed a bright blue as he inserted the heavy metal chip card into the bottom slot. The machine hummed quietly, processing the massive transaction over the country club's secure network. Brenda stood incredibly tall, lifting her chin, attempting to salvage her shattered dignity. She waited for the familiar, satisfying green checkmark that had validated her existence her entire life. Instead, the terminal emitted a sharp, loud, angry red beep. Mr. Harrison frowned, looking down at the digital display. "I am sorry, Mrs. Brenda, but this card has been declined by the issuer," he stated quietly, trying to keep his voice down. Brenda's eyes widened. "That is absolutely impossible," she hissed, her voice cracking. "There is no preset spending limit on that account. You must have entered the numbers wrong. Your machine is broken." "Try another one." She frantically dug back into her wallet, pulling out a black Chase Sapphire Reserve card and a high-tier corporate Visa, connected directly to the real estate firm. She tossed both of them onto the black leather folio in Mr. Harrison's hands. "Run them both. Split the payment. Do whatever you have to do to make that machine work." Mr. Harrison sighed softly, the polite customer service facade beginning to crack under the immense pressure of an unpaid six-figure invoice. He picked up the black card and inserted it into the terminal. Processing. Another sharp, angry red beep. "Declined," he announced, his voice growing noticeably colder. He did not hesitate this time. He immediately picked up the corporate Visa and swiped it. Beep. Declined. Brenda let out a short, hysterical gasp. She grabbed her wallet and simply dumped the entire contents onto the glass table. Dozens of credit cards, debit cards, and exclusive country club membership cards scattered across the polished surface. "Run all of them!" she shrieked, completely losing her mind. "Call the bank manager. Tell them I am Brenda, and they need to authorize these charges right this second. I am a millionaire. You know who I am." I watched her completely unravel, a pathetic display of wealth addiction suddenly cut off from its supply. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "It is not a machine error, Mom," I said smoothly, my voice easily cutting through her frantic yelling. "And the bank manager cannot help you." Brenda froze her hands, hovering over the scattered plastic cards. She slowly turned her head to look at me, absolute terror radiating from her smeared eyes. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I did not do anything," I corrected her calmly. "Mr. Gallagher did. I reminded you that my father's legal trust instructed my lawyer to hand over an entire forensic dossier of your massive corporate embezzlement to the federal authorities this morning. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service receive concrete documented proof of millions of dollars in wire fraud and tax evasion, they do not just send you a polite letter in the mail asking for a meeting. The very first thing they do is secure the stolen assets. I pointed to the useless plastic cards scattered across the table. They petitioned a federal judge for an emergency asset freeze at 9 o'clock this morning. Every single bank account tied to your social security number, your corporate tax identification, and your personal name was completely locked down. You cannot transfer funds. You cannot withdraw cash. You cannot even buy a pack of chewing gum at a gas station, let alone pay off a $150,000 catering bill. You are entirely, completely, and legally broke. Mr. Harrison stared at me, his eyes wide as he finally understood the severity of the situation. He looked down at the pile of declined credit cards, realizing with absolute certainty that the Oak Ridge Country Club was never going to see a single dime of that money from Brenda. Mr. Harrison looked from the useless pile of plastic on the glass table to Brenda's horrified, tear-streaked face. The profound discomfort he felt just moments ago vanished, replaced by the cold logistical reality of a business manager dealing with a massive loss of revenue. "You understand my position, Mrs. Brenda," he said, his voice dropping an octave completely, stripping away the deferential customer service tone. "I cannot allow you to leave this property with a $150,000 unpaid balance. If you cannot provide an immediate viable form of payment, I am legally obligated to contact the local authorities and file a report for grand theft of services." "Call the police over a catering bill!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the tense ballroom. "You cannot be serious. We have been elite members of this country club for 20 years. My husband practically funded the new golf course. You know I am good for it. You just need to give me a few days to sort out this ridiculous legal misunderstanding with the bank." "I am sorry, but country club policy is absolute regarding outstanding event balances," Mr. Harrison replied firmly, pulling a two-way radio from his belt. "And given the nature of the federal asset freeze your daughter just described, I have zero assurance that this club will ever see those funds." He pressed the button on his radio. "Security, please contact the local precinct and have them dispatch officers to the main ballroom immediately. We have a felony theft of services in progress." Ashley, still huddled on the floor, let out a fresh hysterical wail. "Mom, they are calling the cops!" She sobbed, burying her face in her ruined wedding gown. "Do something. Call Tyler back. Call Dad's friends. We cannot go to jail on my wedding day." Brenda stood completely paralyzed, her hands trembling violently by her sides. There was no one left to call. Her powerful friends were currently standing in the room, actively pretending not to know her. Her son had retreated to the far corner of the ballroom, staring at the floor. The absolute reality of her situation was finally crashing down, crushing the last remaining fragments of her arrogant facade. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open for the final time. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the room, their heavy boots thudding against the polished hardwood. The visual contrast was incredibly jarring. They walked past tables draped in imported silk, towering floral arrangements, and guests wearing $10,000 tuxedos heading straight for the head table. Mr. Harrison stepped forward to meet them quickly, handing over the signed master contract and the itemized unpaid invoice. The lead officer reviewed the paperwork, briefly nodding. He then turned his attention to Brenda, who was visibly shaking in her custom silver gown. "Ma'am, are you the primary signatory on this venue contract?" the officer asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Brenda could not speak. She simply nodded her head, tears carving fresh black paths down her cheeks. "And are you able to provide payment for these services rendered tonight?" the officer pressed, holding up the invoice. "I do not have access to my funds right now," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking so badly she was barely audible. "My accounts are temporarily frozen." The officer let out a short, tired sigh. "In that case, ma'am, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are being placed under arrest for felony theft of services. Brenda let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as the officer stepped behind her. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click of the cuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly over the soft jazz music which the band had completely stopped playing. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had spent decades destroying everyone around her to maintain an illusion of absolute superiority, was now standing in the middle of her own extravagant party in handcuffs. Ashley screamed, trying to scramble backward away from the second officer, who was now approaching her. "I did not sign anything," Ashley cried defensively, holding her hands up. "It was her contract. I am just the bride. I do not have any money." "You are listed as the co-signer on the secondary vendor agreements, Miss," the second officer stated flatly, reaching for his own handcuffs. "Stand up, please." Ashley refused to move, sobbing hysterically on the floor. The officer simply reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and hauled her to her feet. He secured her wrists behind her back, the heavy steel catching against the delicate lace of her wedding gown. Every single guest in the room had their phones out. The flashes of cameras illuminated the ballroom like a red carpet event, but there was no glamour here. Only absolute devastating humiliation. Brenda and Ashley, the toxic mother and her fraudulent golden child, were paraded down the center aisle of the country club. They walked past the people they had desperately tried to impress, weeping uncontrollably, their designer gowns dragging against the floor. They were escorted out the front doors, placed into the back of a waiting squad car, and driven away into the night, leaving behind nothing but an unpaid bill and the shattered remains of their fake empire. Exactly 30 days have passed since the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the manicured lawns of the Oak Ridge Country Club. In the world of high finance, a month is barely enough time to close a funding round. But in the world of federal indictments and absolute financial ruin, 30 days is a lifetime. The fallout was merciless, thorough, and completely irreversible. My mother, Brenda, the woman who once dictated the social hierarchy of the local elite with an iron fist, no longer resides in her sprawling colonial estate. The morning after the canceled wedding, the county sheriff arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, just as I promised. They changed the locks and placed a highly visible foreclosure notice on the wrought iron gates. Federal agents followed shortly after, executing the asset seizure warrants. They loaded her expensive custom furniture, her extensive collection of designer handbags, and her luxury vehicles onto government flatbed trucks. Brenda currently lives in a $40 a night motel located directly off the interstate highway, miles away from the affluent neighborhoods she used to terrorize. Her new reality consists of a flickering neon vacancy sign buzzing outside a single-pane window, paper-thin walls that offer absolutely no privacy, and the lingering smell of stale cigarette smoke embedded in the cheap carpet. She is completely alone. She spends her miserable days sitting on a sagging mattress, desperately trying to navigate the overwhelming labyrinth of personal bankruptcy with a severely overworked court-appointed public defender. Because her assets are entirely frozen by the government, she cannot afford a high-powered legal team to fight the federal charges of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Every single one of her wealthy country club friends immediately blocked her phone number the moment her humiliating mugshot hit the local evening news. The woman who once believed she was entirely untouchable is now just another terrified criminal defendant waiting for her inevitable prison sentence to begin. She has no leverage left. She tries to call the country club to beg for her membership dues to be refunded, only to be hung up on by the same receptionists she used to verbally abuse. She eats cheap microwave dinners and watches the headlights of passing trucks illuminate her dingy room, trapped in a prison of her own making, long before she ever steps foot inside a federal penitentiary. The sheer arrogance that fueled her entire life has been completely hollowed out by the terrifying weight of the justice system. The reality for her precious golden child is equally brutal. Ashley did not get her fairy tale ending. She did not get her wealthy tech husband to bail her out, and she certainly did not get to keep her lucrative career as a visionary fashion designer. The massive intellectual property lawsuit filed by the independent Etsy artists moved forward with terrifying speed. Without Tyler's financial backing, or my mother's stolen money to hire defense attorneys, Ashley was completely defenseless. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a woman who committed identity theft to fund a fraudulent luxury lifestyle. Her boutique was immediately shuttered by court order, and her entire remaining inventory of stolen, poorly manufactured designs was seized and destroyed. Today, the former bride, who wore a custom lace gown and screamed about ruining her perfect aesthetic works, the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. Ashley spends her nights wearing a stiff, unflattering polyester uniform that constantly smells of old frying grease and cheap bleach. Instead of sipping expensive champagne and accepting unearned compliments, she now spends her time wiping down sticky laminate tables, refilling cheap coffee mugs, and taking orders from exhausted truck drivers at 3 in the morning. Her manicured nails are ruined, her hair is tied back in a messy net, and her feet ache constantly from standing on the hard linoleum floors. But the absolute worst part of her new existence is payday. Because of the court-ordered restitution stemming from the class action lawsuit, the majority of her minimum wage paycheck is automatically garnished before she even sees a single penny. Every grueling hour she spends carrying heavy trays of greasy food goes directly into the pockets of the small independent artists she maliciously stole from. She is living strictly paycheck to paycheck, in a tiny cramped apartment, constantly looking over her shoulder for aggressive debt collectors. The endless stream of unearned privilege that defined her entire existence has completely dried up, leaving her to face the harsh, unforgiving real world she had successfully avoided for 30 years. Tyler somehow managed to quickly walk out of the country club before the police arrived, but escaping the venue did not mean he escaped the massive consequences of his own staggering arrogance. By the very next morning, the brutal reality of my withdrawn $5 million term sheet hit his tech startup like a devastating financial earthquake. In the high-stakes venture capital world, rumors travel faster than light. When the industry realized that Blackwood Ventures had abruptly pulled their seed funding at the absolute last minute, a massive, uncontrollable panic erupted among his early angel investors. They all invoked their emergency exit clauses, simultaneously demanding the immediate repayment of their initial capital. Tyler tried to scramble, making desperate, sweating phone calls to secondary investors, begging for a temporary bridge loan just to cover his massive international server costs and his impending employee payroll. But nobody wanted to touch a founder who had proven to be that emotionally volatile, especially one who had almost legally tied himself to a family now facing federal criminal indictments. Within exactly 14 days, his predictive software company officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court stepped in. His corporate accounts were entirely liquidated by a court-appointed trustee to pay off his secured creditors. Tyler was forced to immediately surrender his expensive downtown office space fire, his entire dedicated development team without severance, and break the lease on his luxury high-rise apartment. The arrogant, condescending tech bro, who had confidently stood in his velvet tuxedo and threatened to buy my mother a 10,000-square-foot mansion just to spite me, is now completely ruined. He currently sleeps on a cheap futon in his former college roommate's basement, desperately sending out resumes for entry-level coding jobs just to afford his basic living expenses. Now, every single time he opens his laptop, he is forced to see industry news articles detailing the spectacular collapse of his once promising startup. He has become a cautionary tale in Silicon Valley about the dangers of unchecked ego and mixing bad personal relationships with venture capital. While Tyler foolishly lost his superficial tech company, my older brother Jason lost something infinitely more valuable. When Kendra handed him those divorce papers at the ruined wedding reception, Jason honestly thought she was just making a dramatic emotional point. He genuinely believed he could give her a few days to cool off, buy her some expensive jewelry, and casually apologize his way back into his comfortable suburban life. but Kendra meant every single syllable she spoke. By the time Jason finally drove back to their shared house that night, he found half the closets completely empty, her personal belongings gone, and the heavy front door locks already scheduled to be changed by her aggressive divorce attorney. Today, Jason is living in a tiny, incredibly depressing studio apartment on the noisy industrial side of the city. He has no large dining room table to host his wealthy country club buddies, no perfectly manicured lawn to maintain, and absolutely zero respect from any of the successful people around him. He spends his long, miserable evenings sitting on a cheap folding chair in the middle of the room, eating cold takeout food entirely alone, staring blankly at the bare white walls. The crushing weight of his lifelong cowardice has finally settled permanently onto his shoulders. He finally understands the true devastating cost of his actions. He spent 35 years terrified of upsetting a deeply toxic mother who only ever used him to bolster her own fragile ego. He convinced himself that by staying quiet, looking the other way, and actively avoiding conflict, he was somehow keeping the peace in our family. But his silence was never peaceful. His silence actively enabled the relentless emotional abuse of his younger sister, and it completely alienated a brilliant, deeply loyal wife who had desperately tried to protect him from his own family's poison. Jason tries to call Kendra every single week, leaving pathetic, sobbing voicemails begging for a conversation, begging for a second chance to prove he can be a real man. But those desperate calls are always routed directly to her legal counsel, and they remain entirely unanswered. He has no family left to fall back on. Brenda is entirely consumed by her own legal defense and constantly demands money Jason does not have. Ashley refuses to speak to him because he did not offer her a place to stay. He is now an isolated island of complete and utter misery every single day. He sacrificed his integrity, his beautiful marriage, and his self-respect on the altar of family loyalty, only to realize that the family he was fiercely protecting never actually cared about him at all. While Jason sits in his dark, silent apartment, mourning the wreckage of his own cowardly choices, I am standing in a space completely bathed in brilliant, unforgiving California sunlight. The scene shifts entirely away from the dreary foreclosed colonial estates and the cheap motels of my past. I am looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my private executive office on the top floor of the Blackwood Ventures headquarters in Silicon Valley. The view is spectacular. Below me, the bustling, innovative heart of the tech world moves with a relentless forward momentum. The office itself reflects that exact same energy. It is sleek, aggressively modern, and designed with clean lines of glass, polished concrete, and natural wood. There are no shadows here. There is nothing hidden, no secrets buried in locked filing cabinets, and absolutely no toxic family dynamics suffocating the air. The heavy glass door to my office swings open with a soft, satisfying click. I turn away from the panoramic view of the city to see Kendra stepping over the threshold. She looks absolutely incredible. The exhausted, tense posture she used to carry while sitting next to my brother at those agonizing Sunday dinners is completely gone. She is wearing a razor-sharp tailored navy blue power suit that radiates absolute authority and confidence. Her dark hair is styled perfectly, and her eyes hold a fierce, uncompromising spark that Jason was always far too weak to appreciate. Kendra is not just visiting my office for a casual social call. I hired her exactly 2 weeks ago as the new Director of Human Resources and Executive Vetting for Blackwood Ventures. After watching her meticulously gather federal forensic evidence against my mother for 6 months, without ever breaking a sweat or blowing her cover, I knew instantly that she possessed the exact kind of ruthless, analytical mind my firm desperately needed. Venture capital is a brutal industry. We evaluate hundreds of founders every single year, and I need someone who can see right through the arrogant tech bro facade to spot the toxic liabilities hiding underneath. Kendra spent 5 years studying the ultimate toxic liabilities in my own family. She can spot a fraud like Tyler or a parasite like Ashley from a mile away. She walks confidently across the polished floor and drops a sleek electronic tablet onto my heavy oak desk. I just finished the final background evaluations on the new cohort of seed stage founders. Kendra announces, her voice crisp and entirely professional. I flagged 3 potential candidates for severe ego issues and recommended we pass on their funding immediately. One of them actually reminded me a lot of your former brother-in-law. I smile, walking over to the custom Italian espresso machine sitting on the marble credenza against the far wall. Excellent work, Kendra. If they share even a single personality trait with Tyler, we are not giving them a single dime of our capital. I select 2 ceramic cups and press the button. The machine whirs to life, grinding the premium dark roast beans and filling the bright office with the rich, bold aroma of fresh coffee. Kendra walks over and leans against the marble counter, crossing her arms comfortably. It is still hard to believe how fast everything changed, she remarks quietly, watching the dark liquid pour into the cups. Jason tried to call me again this morning. He left another crying voicemail about how empty his apartment is. I deleted it after 5 seconds. I do not feel sorry for him anymore. I just feel free. I hand her one of the warm ceramic cups and pick up the other for myself. You feel free because you finally cut the dead weight, I tell her, looking directly into her eyes. You stopped letting them drag you down into their miserable, fabricated reality. I raise my espresso cup slightly, holding it out between us. Brenda spent my entire life trying to drill a very specific toxic narrative into my head. She demanded blind obedience and called it love. She used the excuse of blood relations to justify decades of emotional abuse, theft, and absolute cruelty. She wanted us to believe that you are forever chained to the people who share your genetics, no matter how terribly they treat you. But she was completely wrong. Kendra raises her cup, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. Blood does not make a family. She agrees, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Loyalty makes a family, I conclude firmly. Mutual respect, honesty, and showing up for each other when the entire world is falling apart. That is what actually matters. We clink our small ceramic cups together. The sharp, clear chime of the porcelain rings out through the bright, sunlit executive office, completely drowning out the lingering echoes of the past. We take a sip of the bitter, perfect espresso, standing shoulder to shoulder at the very top of the empire we fought so hard to secure. We are not just surviving anymore. We are absolutely thriving, and we are doing it entirely on our own terms. Exactly 1 year after that morning espresso with Kendra, I found myself standing in a place I had once thought was permanently stolen from me. The heavy, polished oak podium felt solid and grounding beneath my hands. The bright auditorium lights beamed down, illuminating the faces of 500 eager undergraduate students sitting in tiered rows before me. Behind me, projected onto a massive digital screen, was the unmistakable cardinal red crest of Stanford University. I was not there as a wide-eyed freshman desperately seeking validation from an admissions board. I was standing there as the keynote speaker for the annual Silicon Valley Entrepreneurship Summit. I looked out at the sea of bright, ambitious students. They were clutching their notebooks and digital tablets, waiting for me to reveal the secret formula to building a billion-dollar venture capital empire. They expected me to talk about market disruption, algorithmic scaling, and aggressive financial leveraging. But as I stared at the university seal that my mother had literally fed into a paper shredder 12 years ago, I realized that my massive success had absolutely nothing to do with traditional business strategy. It had everything to do with survival. I leaned into the microphone. Its soft hum reverberated through the massive lecture hall. I did not open my speech with a corporate joke or a complex financial statistic. I opened it with the brutal truth. I told them about a teenage girl who waited by the mailbox every single day, only to be told she was completely worthless. I told them about the agonizing pain of believing you are a fundamental failure because the person who is supposed to love you the most actively manufactured your defeat. The massive auditorium was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. 500 students sat completely paralyzed, captivated by the raw honesty of a woman who had clawed her way out of a toxic nightmare to reach the very top of their desired industry. As I spoke, a profound realization washed over my entire being. For over a decade, I had carried the phantom weight of that stolen acceptance letter, like a heavy stone around my neck. I had actively grieved for the alternate version of Madison, who got to walk these beautiful campus quads, live in the dorms, and experience a normal, supportive coming of age. But looking at these students, I finally understood the incredible gift my mother had unwittingly handed me. If Brenda had never intercepted that envelope, if I had simply packed my bags and attended Stanford at 18, I would have been soft. I would have trusted people easily. I would have expected the corporate world to be fair and meritocratic. Brenda's cruelty burned all of that naive optimism entirely out of my system. Her betrayal forced me to operate in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the real world before I was even out of my teens. She taught me to verify every single piece of information, to never rely on anyone else for my financial security, and to anticipate deception from the people sitting closest to me. She tried to crush my spirit, but she accidentally forged my armor. That shredded piece of paper made me ruthless, sharp, and utterly untouchable. It made me exactly the kind of apex predator you have to be to conquer the venture capital industry. I did not succeed in spite of her sabotage. I succeeded because her sabotage made me completely bulletproof. I finished my lecture by telling the students that the greatest competitive advantage they will ever possess is their own resilience. I told them that the worst things that happen to them can either become their permanent excuses or their ultimate origin stories. When I finally stepped back from the podium, the silence held for one perfect heartbeat before the entire auditorium erupted. 500 students jumped to their feet, delivering a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. The applause washed over me, a warm, overwhelming wave of validation that completely erased the last lingering ghosts of my childhood. I smiled, walking off the stage with my head held high, my closure finally absolute. And that brings us to the end of my story. You cannot choose where you come from. You cannot choose the family you are born into, the traumas they inflict, or the manipulative lies they force you to swallow. But you hold the pen to write your own ending. You decide when the abuse stops. You decide when to walk away from the table, build your own empire, and completely rewrite the narrative they tried to assign to you. The blood in your veins does not dictate your destiny. Your courage does. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make the terrifying decision to cut off a toxic family member to save your own sanity? Have you ever turned a devastating betrayal into your greatest success? Tell me your story down in the comments below. Let us build a community of survivors who refuse to be victims. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of revenge and success, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay strong, stay ruthless, and always write your own ending.